Hello, Brain Damaged Philosopher here. In this video, I'm going to discuss the incoherency of the concept of God found in modern apologetics. I am not going to be discussing the incoherency of the concept of God in specific religions, although this is totally possible to do, especially at least in the case of Christianity, because that's a completely different set of problems and requires specific quoting from the Christian scriptures, because you're talking specifically about the Christian God, and it's just a whole different bag of worms. Instead, I'm just interested in whether the God that the modern metaphysical arguments that Christians give to support their scriptures, a God which is different than the God portrayed in their scriptures, I might add, is actually coherent in any way. And I don't think it is. But let me lay out what I mean by the God of modern apologetics briefly. Basically, I'm referring to the God of, among other things, the cosmological argument. The timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind, which has the properties of omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and omnipresence. So the first inherent contradiction in this concept is, of course, the problem of a timeless mind. For what we call a mind is an information processing system which generates thoughts that compound on each other in a sort of sequential fashion and make decisions, both of which require a sort of linear progressive series which requires time. Of course, now a possible objection to this is to simply say that while God exists outside of time, he is extended in time. However, this is exactly the sense in which the universe exists as well, at least if we are adhering to the modern conception of time found in modern physics. So to say that would be just to admit that God has the property of time again, so that doesn't really fix the problem. So, in fact, a timeless mind is a contradiction, so you either have to get rid of the mind property or the timelessness property. Additionally, if we're assuming that the mind is conscious, which I think is probably reasonable when you're talking about a God, this raises another question, or problem, which is that consciousness requires something to be conscious of in order to jumpstart the causal process that generates the consciousness. Yet, God is completely separate and, at least in the general meaning of apologetics, when we're not talking about pantheism, antecedent to anything but himself. However, consciousness cannot bootstrap from being conscious of itself because in order for there to be a self to be conscious of, that self would have to originate, and where else could that self come from? But from being that consciousness to be conscious of would have to be conscious of something, and so either it's conscious of itself, and you get this sort of infinite regress, or it's conscious of something external, and so ultimately, for God to have consciousness, something external and around God would have to exist. Furthermore, the other problem is that it's unclear what a mind would be without a substrate within which it exists. Because a mind, again, is an information processing system. As far as I can tell, I don't think it's actually coherent to posit mindness apart from a substrate that probably requires spatial extension. Obviously, this is less of an objection than the previous ones, but I still think it's a problem. Because, delving into what it would actually mean to be a spaceless, substrateless mind raises a lot of metaphysical and definitional questions that are actually quite problematic, and I don't see a clear solution to besides simply taking it at face value that this is a coherent concept. Furthermore, there are actually problems with the properties of this mind as well. For instance, omniscience. So the problem with omniscience is that there are such things as unknown unknowns. Intelligence could wrongly think that it is omniscient, and it would have no way to check whether it is omniscient or not, because the fact that it knows every detail of the sensorium available to it, and that its knowledge is completely accurate, right, coextensive with what it thinks is available to know, doesn't mean that it can know that the sensorium available to it is actually all that there is to know. If knowledge is justified true belief, then I don't think a so-called omniscient being could ever have justified knowledge that it actually is omniscient, because it's conceivably possible that it could simply be fooled, be put into a simulation where it knows everything about the simulation, but has no way of finding out that there's anything outside of the simulation, so it thinks it knows everything that there is, and there would be no way for it to fix this. So omniscience actually isn't possible, because it's not possible to know if you are omniscient. And if you can't know that if you are omniscient, right, like that sort of breaks down the whole idea, because then there's a whole range of other things that you might not know. This is actually something that Dark Matter 2525 did a animated video on, which I forget the title of, but I highly recommend that you look up. There are also problems with omnipotence as well. Similar problems, in fact. So, first of all, there are obvious problems with absolute omnipotence, but no real modern apologist adheres to absolute omnipotence for those reasons, right? Can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it, or can God create a married bachelor, are objections that are only really efficacious if you're talking to someone who holds to absolute omnipotence. And so obviously very few people do, because those are easy objections to raise. However, there are still problems with logically possible omnipotence. First of all, this sort of raises a semi-Euthyphro dilemma style problem for those who think that it's necessary to have God in order to have the logical absolutes. And who think that without a God, reality wouldn't adhere to logic. Because now, logic is something that even God can't break, so it's something outside of him, and suddenly the transcendental argument breaks down, because the logical absolutes actually supersede over God, and are external to God, and so you don't need a God for them. A possible attempt at a solution to this problem is to claim that following the logical absolutes is part of God's nature, and so he can be omnipotent while not being able to violate his nature, simply because it's not in his nature to do so, even if he conceptually could. Although I'm not clear on what that could actually means. Obviously, the objection to this is that nothing in the universe, neither you nor I nor the monkey down the street, can violate its nature, and we can all do everything that's within our nature to be able to do, so suddenly everyone's omnipotent. Another problem with omnipotence that's less a problem of the concept of omnipotence and more a problem with defining omnipotence is that if we apply words based on a set of conditions that we expect that the word that we expect to hold in order to bestow the use of that word on something, So if words represent a common set of properties, and we only apply a word when those properties hold to above a certain threshold, then what sort of properties can we actually confirm that would allow us to call something omniscient or omnipotent, right? Because for a normal word, there's a finite number of properties, or even if there's an infinite number of properties, there's a finite threshold beyond which it's reasonable to apply that word to something. Meanwhile, however, for omnipotence and omniscience, by their very nature, not only is the list infinitely long, but the threshold is infinitely high, so that we could actually never be justified in applying such a word to something, because the properties that the word refers to could never be established to hold above the required threshold. Yeah. I think that's really all I wanted to say. Now again, none of this proves that it's impossible for something worth calling a god to exist. And nothing here even necessarily proves that something very similar to the God of modern apologetics can't exist. But I still think that the fact that there are problems with identifying and problems with coherently defining the God that is required by modern apologetics is a telling indication of the state of the arguments and the state of the field itself. All right, thank you for listening. Bye.